Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming to our conversation about art criticism. And a big thank you to Paul Laster, Seph Rodney, and Jane Harris for joining me. I am Bill Carroll. I'm the director of the EFA Studio Program. And the Elizabeth Foundation for the Art has three programs: the Studio Program, the EFA Project Space, and the EFA Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop. So it's an active, amazing community in the middle of Manhattan with really talented artists and people doing incredible stuff. And we were closed for 3 months, but we have been reopened since July 1st, and most of the artists are using their studios. So we're chugging along, getting close back to normal. I would like to ask the three guests to introduce themselves. But rather than just read off your bios, I'm curious how you ended up doing what you're doing. So I thought I'd start off with a question, and I'm going to start with you, Seph. So had I met you at 6 years old, and I asked you, what do you want to be when you grow up? You would have said art critic?
No, probably not. I probably would have said something like attorney. No, I would have, the word I would have used would have been lawyer. And actually, I want to say, I can say this, which is a kind of entree into that story and an indication of my personality. When I was quite young, one of the things that my parents, both my mom and dad, said to me a lot was that they were impressed by the degree to which I was argumentative. I like to argue. I like to mobilize facts and ratiocination, like logical, rational progression to make a point. And I guess for my age, I was pretty good at that. So I don't think I would have said critic, but I would have said someone who is able in the moment to use their verbal skills to construct an argument.
That's great. So how did it proceed that you ended up being an art critic?
How did what?
How did your journey proceed that you ended up being an art critic?
Okay, so I'm gonna do the real like bare bones version because I don't want to take up a lot of time. Because I am much more interested in hearing Paul's story and Jane's story. But the sort of succinct version of this is I was in college and I fell in love with art. I fell in love with photography, actually. Black and white photography, people like Mino White. I never pronounced this man's name correctly, but Iko Hoso, the Japanese photographer, people of that ilk. And I knew that I felt that I was smart enough to go on to get my MA or PhD, but I didn't want to do that before I'd given myself the chance to become an artist myself so that I could make work and not just talk about other people's work. So that was pretty clear to me in my mid-20s. And then I went off to California, UC Irvine, did my MFA in photo, got out and spent what I'd like to call many years in the wilderness. I was lost, I didn't really know what to do with myself. I didn't like to teach, I wasn't very good at it. Ended up in retail. I actually ended up working for Hugo Boss for a few years and then working for Armani in Beverly Hills. And as you can imagine, I fucking hated it. It was an awful, awful existence. It was shallow and tiresome. And then I got myself together, got a therapist, figured some stuff out, went to London to work on my PhD. After 9 grueling years I would never want to repeat, I finally got it in 2015. And the next year I got on staff at Hyperallergic after a long courtship. And Hyperallergic's been the best job I've ever had. I actually get to talk about things that are really meaningful to me, and I get paid to do it. So that's the route. I mean, I could not have said to you 10 years ago that this is where I would end up, but I probably could have said to you something about what I wanted my life to look like, and this is it. I mean, essentially, I have good conversations most of the days.
You can't ask for more than that.
Mm.
Thank you. That was great. Jane, same question.
Well, 6 years old, I probably wanted to be anything from a nurse to a gymnast to Dolly Parton. You know, I was just kind of running wild out with my friends. And honestly, I don't know that I don't remember, but I do know at some point in time I wanted to be a nurse. I guess a lot of little girls do. And, you know, in a more sort of quicker summary, I came through to writing about art through a kind of American studies, gender studies background. So I kind of immersed myself in my undergraduate work and then my graduate work in both a kind of, I was a dual major in cultural anthropology, but I was always kind of interested in subculture. And you know, American studies, right, or cultural studies. And so for me, art's always been wedded to culture. And I guess in some sense, even politics, although not in a literal sense. But I remember once having a discussion with another art writer, and I kind of think of myself as an art writer more than a critic. For some reason, the word I just don't relate to that word. But it was Ken Johnson, and we were talking, he was kind of firing a lot of questions at me about my background. And anyway, through that discussion, it became clear that he sort of summarized me as saying, oh, so you like art that's about culture. And I remember thinking, well, art is culture for me. So, and it kind of reoriented me again in a weird way to the fact that that's how I came to art, was through friends and, you know, people in my kind of political queer feminist world who were making art. And really there was a Chilean woman who was teaching in the women's studies program, and she taught some classes that were, you know, related to craft making things like enamel, and I kind of just through her, and also my best friend was working at Hall Walls, the art organization in Buffalo where I went to undergraduate. And so a lot of my friends were artists. And then I just decided to kind of, after a long relationship ended, to pick up and move to New York. And I got this postgraduate degree in museum studies at NYU, which was more or less useless, but it did launch me on a new path to start writing about art. Although I first started writing about film for Time Out before I actually started writing about art.
Right.
Excellent, thank you. Paul.
Sure.
Well, at 6 years old, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but in high school, I became interested in history. And then my last year of high school, my stepfather was in the Air Force and he was transferred to Germany. So being in Europe, I became, my interest in art was first through photography. And I bought a camera because of my interest in history and being in this environment, rich environment in the 1970s in Europe. I started taking pictures. Then I moved to New York to go to school. I went to FIT at first and studying photography. But being at that point, it was like 1977, and being kind of like the punk era, I rebelled against what I wanted to do and started becoming an artist. And so rather than a photographer, I started making art. And I had a job at the Museum of Modern Art where I worked from 77 to 88. And so, of course, that brought me further in. I started showing in the East Village. I started showing in different places around the world, and became very successful as an artist until the early 90s when the whole economy, the art economy crashed. And so I didn't have a degree because I had gone like straight from like a few years of study at FIT, at Cooper Union, at the SVA and other places just independently. I started working at Tony Shabrazi Gallery first at doing installations because my wife and I, Renee Ricardo, had been independently curating shows. We'd been curators at PS1, adjunct curators. We'd curated for independent curators, so it was simultaneously making art and curating exhibitions of postmodernist art. And so when I started this job at Shabrazi, I quickly segued into producing the catalogs for the artist. And I was commissioning writers to write the catalog essays. And when I decided to leave, when Tony Shabrazi took on the Francis Bacon estate, Tony said, Paul, you've got to work a little bit harder. And I was already working 50 hours a week in 4 days and still trying to maintain an art career. So I left, and Walter Robinson asked me if I would start writing for ArtNet. So I started a column called Brooklyn Spice, and Walter tutored me as a writer, and I soon became an editor at Russell Simmons One World and an editor at Flavor Pill, and then we started Art Crush. Jane was there at the beginning too when we started Art Crush together. And then went on to write, I had previously been writing also for Time Out, and then started, just writing freelance for as many people as I could, Art in America, through meeting different people as well. That's one of the great things that we do as critics when we go to press previews and stuff. We interact, like, Seph and I have met in those types of circumstances, and I see Jane in those types of circumstances.
No, I never go.
You never go? Yeah. Well, but we catch up.
I'm never there.
It's great.
But we see each other at openings sometimes, yes.
Yeah, we do. Or just even out seeing shows. But, like Jane, I don't consider myself so much a critic because I probably in all the years of writing, I've probably only given like 3 to 5 bad reviews. For the most part, I consider myself a champion. I feel like I'm more in the camp of Harold Rosenberg, of championing art that I like, that I follow, and my interests are pretty diverse because I'm also an editor at Art Asia Pacific. As we were talking about earlier, I like everything high-low, street culture to Jasper Johns and other things that are on the fine art end. Frank Stella I've interviewed, and I like writing about things at all levels because for me it's a learning process.
So I just want to. If I may, Bill, I just want to say something about that term critic.
Yeah.
So this will sound a little bit name droppy, but whatever. I was having tea with Roberta Smith about, when was it? Wow, that was more than a year ago. Wow. Yeah, more than a year ago. And we were talking about being writers and critics and la, la, la. And she said, she very much considers herself a critic because what she/we do is we render a judgment. And at some point in a lot of what we write, and it's not, and I think it's true that in a good deal of what I write, I do other things, like I tell stories or I bring in poetry, but most often I would say, and this is why I'm comfortable using the word critic to define myself, most of the time I'm rendering a judgment.
Well, that actually leads right into my next question, which is how art criticism has kind of changed. Like I'm hanging out with, I had friends who were hanging out with Jackson Pollock and Bill de Kooning, and they always talked about when the art world was much smaller. And you would put up a show and a lot of people would write about it because there were very few shows. And there was a lot of critical writing. There was where people were being critical. And I've had just what Paul said, and I've had other people, David Ebony says the same thing to me, that at this point the art world has become so big and there's so many shows that basically, why write about something you don't like? You're championing the things you do like. But that said, I was having lunch, not tea, with a critic who was at a major publication for 25 years, and he had just quit after 25 years. And the issue was for almost all those years, he had the same editor who was extremely supportive and always told him, I want your voice.
Mm.
Don't hold back.
Mm.
New editor, he wrote a review of, I guess, kind of a, an important show, and it was, I think, pretty negative, and got a lot of pushback. And this new editor really wanted him to pull back. So is that where we're at? That basically people are only writing about what they like, and is there any value to actual criticism and like critical writing?
No, there
Well,
is value, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Paul, you've been around the longest. What do you
Yeah,
got?
and then I'll let Jane jump in. I mean, I say that's my choice is to be a champion, but I certainly respect what Seph and Roberta do and others. There's other critics that I admire and read all the time. I mean, I just think it's a matter of different paths that we choose. And I, totally understand the value of a judgment as well. I guess for me, I'd like to do research and then find parallels between other things in the world that might give insight into what an artist is doing. And sometimes that's based on judgment as well. It's based on a theory or based on, but I also love talking to artists to find out what their intentions are. Because I remember doing an interview with Paul Schimmel, and I said to Paul, I said, what's the difference between curating a show with a living artist and curating a show with an artist that's deceased? And he said, well, with a living artist, you can find out what their intentions are, and I think that, like take an artist like Picabia, who was just interviewing Vito Schnabel about this show of Picabia and Man Ray. And Picabia, when the MoMA show was on, there's so and little that we know about these different bodies of works of his, because he didn't have the opportunity to really talk about them. There's no archive there about written information about the work. So it's all open to interpretation. So, but I totally value what Seph and, people like Roberta do as well. I mean, that's why we read you guys. But Jane, you were about to say something as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember now. I basically, I think that Roberta is of a school, particularly writing for the New York Times and in a kind of, journalistic platform, right? Where, it's intrinsic to the review and the whole kind of trajectory of the review that there's a pronouncement or an evaluation of sorts. And I did a lot of review writing in my early years. And after I felt like I kind of mastered the form, because it's a lot trickier than non-writers realize to cram in, describe the work and then try to find a point of view. And then I just started feeling like, in a way, kind of echoing Paul, that I'd rather be a platform for artists that I want to have dialogues with or I want to explore the ideas and things in their work. And so, I mean, I find myself just preferring to do catalog essays and interviews and longer reviews where I can also, get into a really deep dive with an artist and try to say something that hasn't already been said. And because I just, we could read so many reviews where you just feel like, okay, I read this already. So it's not that I don't think there's value in the kind of, as I call it, pronouncement, criticism. And I think that Roberta was just, and still is kind of genius. She cuts through and she just lays it out there. But I don't know that is going to survive as much as, because we've got so many diverse platforms now. I think that art writing is just mutating along with all those platforms, and without getting into it, because I want to hear what Seph has to say. But I also think that editors, make have a big influence on art criticism. And if you want to talk about that later, we can talk about that later, but I'll let Seph talk.
I think maybe we'll get into editors, but go ahead, Seph.
So I have this one example, which is, I mean, I have more than one in the back of my head, but here's one that's, I think, kind of quintessential bad, great review, which is one that I encountered back, I think it was back in 2017 when it was written by R.M. Vaughn for Art of City. No paintings for old men, I'm done with Amy Feldman. So let me just read the first sentence or two. I have to hand it to NYC-based painter Amy Feldman. Not every artist can cause me to temporarily lose the will to carry on writing and the energy to carry on chronicling our bankrupt post-meaning culture. What, I wondered as I wandered around the palatial Blaine/Southern Gallery, is the damn point anymore? Like, I mean, the guy, like, out of the gate, Vaughn, like, begins to set up this conversation between not just him and Amy Feldman. I'm assuming it's a him, I don't know that, because I don't know who R.M. Vaughn really is, but between Vaughn and Amy Feldman, and as a way to cast a light on what our culture generally is doing. That, for me, that kind of small to big picture stuff is really, I think, valuable in criticism, like specifically in that moment where we render a judgment, not just about the thing, but what the thing points to about it, about our culture in general.
Yeah, well, I think that comes into play in things that I do, you know, it's just a matter of, I guess I'm making a distinction between, you know, a verdict of sorts on an artist show. And I did do that. And I do remember in the 90s, you know, a lot of my non-American friends, they would say, you know, you Americans are so afraid of like coming out and just saying something negative, you know, the French and, you know, other sort of critics, literary and otherwise, that's what they do. But I think that the climate for it can be mitigated by everything from fear of, you know, some kind of reproach to that artist paid for, their gallery paid for 3 months of ads, so no, you're not, you know. And I did have editors sometimes who would say, hey, Jane, you want to write about, you know, so-and-so? And I would say, well, you know, let me take a look. And then they would kind of clarify, did you, you know, if you like the show. And, you know,
It's just wrong. It's just wrong. I mean, that's just wrong. We should not be doing that.
It's wrong, but it happens, right?
No, I know,
Let's face it.
I know.
Let me say too, the context of a magazine is important. Like, I appreciate Hyperallergic and from the fact that it is a critical publication. When I don't open up, you know, Hyperallergic to look at, thinking that I'm going to have a tour of what to see that's going to make me happy in New York, right? But when I'm writing for Gallery Magazine, I mean, Gallery Magazine is a lifestyle magazine, so it's not a critical magazine. They don't, you know, expect I'm going to be writing an article on Niki de Saint-Phalle. Now, I'm not going to be writing a critical article. I'm going to be writing a profile that goes into like her story, you know, what she made and why she made it, what she was influenced by in the times, stuff like that, you know. So, you know, and what movements she was associated with, all of those types of things to try to make for a colorful, interesting story. But yeah, so it's just, it's also a matter of context. You know, when I was writing for Time Out, when I was writing reviews, they could be more critical. But when I was doing, which for the last, say, 5 years of Time Out, I only did interviews. So the interviews, though, weren't expected to be critical because you don't want to do like a gotcha interview. You know, like with, I remember Howard Halley saying to me about when I was interviewing Carroll Walker for the Domino Sugar Factory for Sugar Baby Piece, he had this question for me to ask her, well, what about, how is it going to benefit the owners of the building, right? Who was on, you know, it was the Dumbo realtors who were on, the son was on the board of Creative Time as well. So, you know, how was it going to benefit them? But I saved that question for last. And of course, as soon as I asked Kara that question, she said, yeah, I was wondering when you were going to get to that, right? So, you know, it's purely a matter of context sometimes as well. Obviously, like you said, Roberta Smith is writing for, the New York Times, the newspaper of note. So we expect all types, but for T Magazine, Michael Miller might not be doing a more critical piece. He might be doing more of a lifestyle piece.
And I get emails a lot from people who reach out to me, and I have no idea where they get my email address from, but they reach out to me with these things like just today, someone asked me to cover something which was some supposedly well-known street artist doing some project with Supreme, which also included the New York Post. And so it was this kind of like quasi art lifestyle promotion thing. And I wrote back, like I usually do, saying, please look at my author page, see what I write. I don't write about stuff like this. And then I broke it down. I said, I don't write about stuff that's just promotional. And I'm certainly never gonna write about anything that's gonna shine a light on the New York Post, which is one of the most racist, sensationalist rags around. Fuck them, by the way. And anyway,
Yeah, that's been their MO forever.
Forever, yeah. But I mean, I say this to people, but I mean, I'm saying this to make this point. Paul and Jane are right that there are lots of different platforms. There are lots of places where you have the promotional stuff happening, and you have the lifestyle stuff happening, and you have the, like, art form is all about like channeling continental philosophy and shoehorning it into a conversation around a work of art, right? Like you have.
What is continental philosophy?
Oh,
that is.
I mean,
what do you mean? I guess I'm just curious to
what I
call
mean
you
is,
to ask a little on that.
no, well, what I mean is all the branches of both postmodern thought, but also post-structuralist, but like the famous ones that are German and French in origin generally.
Okay.
But there's some Swedes in there, and there's some in London we called it continental philosophy because it was, the European continent.
Thank you.
Yeah, so they, so there are different platforms for that. I'm glad that I work at a platform where I'm encouraged, not just allowed, but encouraged to be critical, because I actually think that that's where our culture's kind of lifeblood flows.
Right.
No, but I guess I'll never see when in 1987 I was working at the Brooklyn Museum with Charlotte Kotick in the contemporary art department, and they did this major retrospective of Beverly Pepper.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And John Russell in the New York Times just trashed it. And I can remember the day, like, because, we're waiting for the New York Times review when it came out. And supposedly the story was that she had used every possible straight, connection she could use to get him to do, like they pushed him to do this because she was using all the connections. And he just took the opportunity. He just completely trashed it.
Wow.
But anyway, I think it was entertaining in those days when you actually would read like a really negative.
Yeah, I remember when Peter Plagins wrote about the Jasper Johns show at MoMA, and I wrote him a little note and I said, I really appreciate the risk you took, because he addressed the fact that Johns, who was alive at the time, and I saw this with the Abramovic show at MoMA PS1, they had too much of a hand in the show, and they wanted everything in there, everything. And it starts to dissipate and, but anyway, so I certainly appreciate people who make critical standpoints, in art writing.
Yeah, I also think it's more fair game if it's somebody with like a huge reputation like that, who's had this big career, that maybe that's a moment you can relook at it and be more critical whenever, when they're already really established.
Well, and also bad criticism can be helpful to some artists. I mean, Jeff Koons and Julian Schnabel were trashed by Robert Hughes, and it kind of like gave them something to work against.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Right. And you just mentioned briefly about editors, and as I say, this critic who left this major publication totally because of the editor. I mean, do you find that that's a big issue dealing with editors?
Absolutely.
Yes. I mean, the thing that I've experienced in 20 plus years of writing for, you know, pretty much every publication but the New York Times, so I don't, you know what working with editors there is that, first of all, there's constant changeover. So you work with one editor for a number of years and they leave, and then you have to, you know, kind of work it with another editor, whether they want to work with you or not. They might want to bring on their own sort of people. But the positive thing I will say about editors, particularly like in the analog age, is that they really stepped up my game. You know, I mean, when they paid to edit, they would, you know, I had editors over the years who would just get in there and surgically, you know, sometimes drive me crazy, but they raised my level of sort of expectation. And now when I write, I'm constantly thinking about this is going to get flagged, or, you know, they're going to want to know this and this and this. So, you know, and I don't know that a lot of, as many younger writers are gaining that sort of technical skill from, you know, strong editors.
Well, I had the advantage of working at, when I worked at Flavor Pill and Art Crush, to have an editorial team that was so good. I had proofreaders, I had copy editors, I had, you know, a managing editor who did another read. And then we had, you know, I mean, so each step along the way, copy was edited. And so I learned from that process as well. And I became an editor myself. So I learned in that process of how to edit myself as I'm writing, and then also I'll do a final read and tighten it up, tweak it here and there and there. So for the most part, I don't get edited much on copy, but as far as the personalities of working with editors, that can be very difficult because you can be working for a publication. Like I was working for Garage under Michael Wilson, and I did like maybe 16 interviews. I wrote several articles, you know, and as soon as he was out, I didn't do another piece for them, even though I had correspondence with the editor in chief, and he said, send me stuff. But, you know, it's relative to whoever the editor is. They're choosing their friends and their people that they like, or new people. So, you know, you can be on the in forever and then on the out, like, you know, with Time Out, I wrote for Howard Halley for years. And then, you know, after 25 years, he was out, and, you know, that's an end of that.
Well, are they still around? Time Out? I thought
They're
Time Out
around,
was
but they're
closed.
not in print. They're not in print anymore.
Oh.
And they no longer have an art section. It's only, the art is
Right.
only part of things to do this week. So it's basically just a 100-word blurb.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, I
It
know
is.
that because there was some.
I can say,
comment.
sorry, Bill,
No, go.
as an editor myself, I think that the editing process is crucial. I still am grateful when, and I don't always have this, I should say, but I'm grateful when I have an editor I can trust. Hrog is a great editor for me because Hrog has a wider sense, because he just has more time in the game than I have. He has a greater sense of how sort of institutions operate and what their histories are.
Mhm.
And so when I pride myself on being a certain kind of wordsmith, but I can miss the sort of forest. And Harag can like sort of put me on the map and say, actually, you're here actually now, and you need to sort of be aware of what this ground is. I hope that metaphor
That's good. Yeah.
makes sense. And a couple of other things. I did actually do a workshop for CAA a couple of years back on how to work with an editor. And I think more people need to do that, because I don't think writers know how to work with editors or what to expect from that kind of relationship. I think it's crucial. I think as a writer myself, I know that, again, I'm repeating myself, if I get to trust an editor, that's super helpful for me. Because actually, Paul, I want to say that I slightly disagree with what you say is your experience, which is you edit yourself. I disagree with that because I feel like that is actually a kind of way of stymieing my writing process. Like what I want to do the first time I write something is I want to just like kind of just sort of get it out on the page, and it doesn't make sense yet, but there's some ideas in there. And then on the second go around, hopefully after 24 hours, I can begin to make sense of it and pull and put those ideas in some sort of sensical order. And then, and so I tell myself that I don't want to be editing while I'm writing, because I want to just allow myself to just take those flights of fancy wherever they'll take me. And 3,
You haven't been traumatized enough.
that's fine. That's fine. No, you know
By
what?
editors that rip you to shreds.
No,
Trust me.
No, I've had that. You know what? You know what's interesting? That's great that you say that, Jane, because I remember writing when I just got back to New York and I still hadn't completed my PhD yet. And I wanted to keep in practice, but I hadn't gotten to the point where I had access to the library and I could actually start to do my research, blah, blah, blah. So I wrote because I'm a really huge fan of Sylvia Plath. I wrote to a journal which comes out of the University of Illinois, Plath Profiles. I wanted to write something about Plath because basically I'd been to Poet's House and somebody said some shit about Plath and I disagree with it and I want to write about it. So anyway, I pitched a guy who runs the journal. He said, yeah, sure, write it. Sent it to him, sent it back to me in the mail. I got it back, I opened it up. It was just a sea of red. It was, I was like, wow, do you actually really want me to write this? Because this looks like you hate it from beginning to end. But you know what? He made me a better writer.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And I think that it still exists. You know, I mean, I wrote this catalog essay on Jacoby Satterwhite for this Carnegie show he has coming up. And Andrew Durbin, who's a baby in my eyes, you know, he's like a baby. And he's a good friend of Jacoby's, and he was going to be editing this. And he sent back the edits, and I remember feeling a little bit like, okay, what's this, you know, what is he gonna say? What does he know? But you know what, his edits were helpful. And it took me like a 24-hour period to accept that, because initially I was, you know, being a little bit of a diva about it, like, what the fuck is he talking about, you know? And then, you know, and then I came back to it the next day and I said to myself, Jane, like, these are totally legitimate. And, you know, so I do think it keeps you growing. And like you said, Seph, you oftentimes, you just can't see things. You know, you can't see this larger picture where someone's like, you might have spent, you know, 8 hours thinking about this and you think it's all apparent in these 2 sentences, but I'm not seeing it. And that means that other readers aren't going to see it either.
For sure.
Well,
so yeah, I hope that is not a dying art, because, you know, Paul, you talked about at Flavor Pill, they had a lot of money to have all that staff in place to help you.
And not many places do nowadays. That's
right. That's right. And I think it's becoming, you know, the where the money gets cut is in that realm, in a lot of publications, online and otherwise. So for the sake of younger writers, because I do read things where I think this could be a really good writer, but they're not getting edited and they're just not seeing where they need to improve.
Exactly. That's exactly
right. My editors at Art Asia Pacific are very, very challenging, and there's a lot of back and forth. But I enjoy that process as well, because you know, it's a collaboration. I feel like it always is when you're working with a good editor.
For sure.
But you know, I work for like a dozen different publications, unlike you, Seph, and so I have to also be aware of the voice of each one. It's sometimes like a little bit tricky if I haven't written for that publication in a while, like putting my mind into the mindset of like where it should be to approach whatever I'm writing for them.
For sure, that makes sense. Yeah.
But Seph, you said about a workshop of teaching writers how to work with editors. I love that idea. You know, I teach that professional practice class in Pratt, and that's the whole thing. I'm trying to teach these young artists, how do you deal with the director of the gallery? What's
Right.
your, you know, like these kind of relationships, they're tricky, and if nobody's telling you anything about it, and again, before there was any of this professional practice, you know, I just bumbled through trying to figure this through, you know, out for years. It would have been so helpful to have somebody to actually explain to me
Right.
what it was like these people do and how I'm supposed to react to them. So I love that idea.
So can I give you a quick anecdote? And it's kind of gossipy, so I think people will like it.
I love that.
Okay. So I was working with Antoine Sargent. He was
Yeah.
writing something for Hyperallergic. This was years ago. I want to say like 3 years ago. And it was something about a Black and Blue show. And I remember getting it and thinking, okay, all right, that making my way through the text. And he was doing something I couldn't quite understand. It just didn't gel for me. And I was, I was struggling. Because I didn't exactly get what he was after. And I sent him edits back. He sent his revisions back to me. And I went through it a second time. And I was like, oh, got it. Okay. And then I wrote it out. Like, here's what you're trying to do. Here's what you're doing. Here's where I think you can like tighten it, improve it, blah, blah, blah. And he wrote me back. It was like, I think it was 2 sentences. He said something like, I'm not going to go back and forth on this all day. And then just his phone number. And I was like, who is this pissy,
Right.
like petulant child? Like, what? Like, you don't speak to an editor like that. And it is one of the things that you would say in a workshop is like, you don't pull that kind of shit, even if you're someone who's like a really well-known writer, you don't talk to your editor like that. Like,
Right.
and I wrote him back, I said, look, actually, I'm your editor. If I want to have a phone conversation with you, I'll suggest that we have one. But until then, what I prefer you do is just respond to my written suggestions. And so, you know, we haven't been friends since then. But that's something that you just don't want to do.
No.
Yeah.
No, but
You gotta be tolerant. You gotta be very tolerant of the people you work with. Yeah.
Well, let's face it, there's a lot of tricky people in the art world.
Tricky.
So I did have some more questions, but I realize we're already almost at 6:50. So maybe we should open it up to, and Derek Corner, project manager for the Eva Studio program, is going to help me figure out the question thing. So they can either put it in the chat room or raise their hand.
Yeah, I mean, we prefer if you raise your hand.
Yeah, I think it's better if you ask the question rather than we're kind of reading it.
But if you're shy, certainly put it in the chat on the right, and we'll get to it.
So questions?
So we have one.
Okay.
Hi, I just wanted to know if you see any parallels between the relationship between an artist and a critic, and the critic and the editor.
Well, I mean, I started out as an artist, so, you know, I mean, you know, that's why maybe I'm more sympathetic as a champion versus a critic, because, you know, I was in the role of an artist being criticized, and for the most part, I got good reviews. That's why my career was able to advance as well. It helps, you know. I know artists, and I know artists that might even be on this talk today who've gotten reviews that were damaging and could be psychologically affecting them. It could affect you psychologically, but that they fought back against that too, you know. But I do remember once though being at a show in St. Louis at Greenberg Gallery, and I had given a talk before the or during the before or after the opening, and I guess before the opening or the next day, and the critic totally misunderstood what I said. You know, when I said that something about my work being inspired by some action of Jackson Pollock of doing the drip paintings and the idea of the eye being in constant motion. And the critic wrote, you know, well, he compares himself to Jackson Pollock, but he is no Jackson Pollock, you know, and it wasn't what I was doing at all. So I thought, no, you misunderstood it. Also, too, when I worked at Tony Soprasi Gallery, I remember a very, very well-known critic coming in to see a show of Michael Ray Charles. And Michael Ray Charles had done these diptychs that said, one side said pre-Black and the other side said post-Black. And it's partly like where Thelma Golden got some of the concepts right around that time on, the idea of post-Black. And the critic wrote about only one of the panels, not both, in the diptych, because she never asked a question of the guy.
Right.
So, yeah,
Right.
so, I tend to be wanting to know as much from the artist's point of view, going back to what we were talking about earlier, about knowing the artist's intentions.
Yeah,
So,
I echo that. I mean, I think some artists to answer that question, I think some artists make better, I think actually we could name a lot of artists who make better critics than they did artists, right? Because there's just a lot of them. Jerry Saltz wanted to be an artist, Ken Johnson wanted to be an artist. There's just so many, really white male, our critics who came from, being an artist, Walter Robinson, who's kind of returned to it, and largely because he had, in my opinion, not to throw shade, but, I do feel like his close friendship with Jeffrey Deitch is what got him that show, and he kind of called in everybody, all his chips for all the attention that show got. And I'm not saying I don't think he's a decent artist, but putting that aside, but somebody like Matthew Weinstein, he's a really good writer.
Yeah.
I actually prefer his writing to his current work. Again, I respect his work, but so I think sometimes artists make really good writers.
absolutely.
Seph, do you have anything? What should we?
To be honest with you, I kind of lost the thread.
Okay.
What was the question?
What?
Connections
Like whether-
between artists and critics and editors, I think, right?
Like, there's parallels. I can kind of see from just listening to you all speak about your relationships with your editors, and then like the artists, how they benefit from criticism.
Yeah,
So,
there is one thing, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's one thing I do want to say about that, which is the assumption too often is that the relationship between the artist and critic will either be adversarial or be supportive. No, I actually think that, and I've said this to students at various places where I've taught, Parsons, SVA. I think I said this to maybe some students at Yale too, that it's important for you to imagine cultivating a relationship with arts writers and critics. Cultivate that relationship over time. Like teach them about your work. They're not just going to know from like a gallery visit or from reading some other stuff that other people have written or from conversations with you at openings. Like invite them to do studio visits. This is how I've grown as a writer, because I've had people invite me to their studios and we've gotten into their work in a deeper way than we would have otherwise. And they developed a relationship with me, which ended up, in some cases, like the stuff I wrote, the profiles I wrote for the New York Times last year, I wrote on those artists because I got to know them over years and I got to respect their work.
Right.
So
That's
so
a good thing.
cultivate the
Expect to get about 10 requests for studio visits out of this talk, Seph.
That's right. Actually, I do genuinely have less time for studio visits now, but I'll still do them because they're still really beneficial for me. They are.
No, I love doing studio visits. I think they always keep me optimistic. Whenever I get cynical about the art world and all the politics and machinations, you go to a studio visit and you get into the moment of an artist who's really living for their work, and their practice. And it's
I don't make studio visits though
nice.
without a reason. Like if I'm writing about someone's work or
Yeah.
interview them, I'll make a visit because I always go back to when my wife Renee Ricardo and I curated a show at White Columns in 1986 called Signs of the Real, and Bill Arning had just started there. He had been like Tom Solomon had been the director and Bill was the associate director, and Bill became the director. And Bill would make studio visits with artists like 3 and 4 times, and then never choose them for the program. And so I always thought, like, you know, I don't want to like make studio visits just to build up someone's hopes. You know, I've got to have a reason. You know. But of course, you know, nurturing friendships too. Like if you're friends with, you know, I'm friends with Eric Parker, and if I run into Eric and he says, come over to the studio, I'm going to jump at the opportunity, you know. So, you know, but, you know, I've been around for a long time, so I've met lots and lots of artists in all the different capacities of jobs that I've done as well. So, you know, as a curator as well, you know, so, and Jane also curates. Have you curated, Seth?
I have actually. First opportunity was, I keep confusing the years. Last year was so long ago. God, I think it was 2019 for the show that was delayed and is now opening at Crystal Bridges. I was on the curatorial team for the Crafting America.
Yeah.
Thanks to Glenn Adamson. And then I just curated an online show, my first one for Art at a Time Like This. Just last year, I think it was August or July. Yeah, it was I thought it was a really good show.
Those guys are great.
Happy. Yeah, that's a great project for sure.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well, wearing these different hats helps us get different points of view as well.
Yeah.
We're running out of time, but should we try?
Yeah, we had another question. Justin, do you still want to go?
Who we had?
Justin, he was next on the question list. Well, I don't see him. So, Jason.
You're muted, Justin.
Oh.
Justin, you're muted.
Oh,
there he is. Justin, you want to ask a question?
We still can't hear you. This is weird. He's speaking, but we can't.
Justin, yeah, we can't.
I can't see him.
He's got to unmute in the corner.
He did unmute, but it's still not coming through for some reason. I'll send him a message.
Yeah, maybe it's connection.
Sorry, Justin.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else?
Jason, file.
Jason.
Thanks. This has been great. I was interested in maybe hearing a little bit more about the kind of the different functions of judgment in criticism. I think we were sort of hearing about it on this kind of good-bad dichotomy, but sometimes I'm reading criticism and you know it's criticism, but you're kind of at the end of it, you're sort of like, did they like it? You should have, you know, it's kind of, it's full of a lot of ambiguities, and I enjoy that. And it's sort of, it's almost, you know, it requires a second read to kind of suss out the details. And I was just wondering if, especially Seph, since you were kind of taking the reins on the criticism part in this discussion, maybe if you want to talk about how you think about judgment and the sort of value that it serves and the different ways that it can kind of manifest itself.
Well, I think about meaning. I really think about how things mean. And so when I think about, when I think about rendering a judgment, I don't think about it as being a judgment along the axes of good versus bad. I think about it along the axes of, well, whatever the particular piece is. Like I'm trying to think of a specific, okay, great example, which was a review I wrote of Carroll Walker's show at Sycamore Jenkins that was, one might describe as trashing it, but I don't think I trashed it. I asked pointed questions, but it was just a list of questions. And one of the questions was, I think there were like 15, no, there were like 17 of them. One of them was like, how has the practice changed in the last 10 or 15 years? That would make her, what is she saying now with this show that she hasn't said before? Was one of the questions. And who finds joy in this work and who is made to grieve? So when I'm asking questions like that, I'm not just talking about bad or good. I'm talking about
Right.
how we live with this work, what kind of fantasies these are. What does this say about our culture that we produce work like this, which is just dark and wrenching, and that we celebrate its production? What does that say about us? Right. So asking those sort of questions, I think, is a way of rendering judgment. But in a way that I think Jane is really interested in. I'm interested in making judgments about our culture, like
Yeah.
who we are, that we do shit like
Those
that.
questions have been circulating around her work from the very beginning, you know.
Right,
And I
right.
think what's interesting is how the context, as time changes, the context for how we engage those questions changes, right?
Right.
You know, it's like when I did this interview with Sean Leonardo, you know, talking about just the reception of so many kind of, you know, traumatic images of Black Death, and just how we at a point now where we have to start talking about that, and, you know, our attachment to it, our you know, weird addiction to it.
Well, when I did my interview with Carroll Walker for Time Out related to the Domino Sugar Factory, she gave me a Rosebud Moment. And what it was to me was, she told me that when she moved from California at 12 years old to Georgia, right? She moved from an environment that was very open and free to a place in Georgia where, you know, she was segregated, and she was, you know, there was bias against her, right? But she said that going to the mall, that the Turner Theater 24/7 was playing Gone with the Wind, right? And to me, that was the Rosebud Moment. That was key. She didn't start making that type of work until years later when she was at RISD. But it came up, it came bubbling up, right? And you know, all this antebellum art that she started making really came out of that. I mean, I'm friends with Howardina Pindell, who led the charge against Kara's work and Michael Carroll's work. You know, I understand their work, and I understand Howardina's argument too. But getting back to the idea of judgment, one of the things too that differs, you know, relative to my critical judgment, is my critical judgment coming to it as former artist, or still sometimes artist, is that I look at art for like how it functions, what it adds to the dialogue of contemporary art, like, and also the quality of how it'll stand up, how it, you know, will it last? You know, is it like, you know, I love Terence Coe, but is it like these pieces that he made out of glass that are glued together, and the sculptures inside are made out of chocolate? And, you know, when they were shipped to the collectors, they all fell apart in the box, right? And you know, the person paid, you know, $50,000. They open the box and it's a bunch of junk. And then his dealer tells him, well, that's what it is. So I remember lecturing at Pratt in a sculpture class, and this artist made his work all out of sugar cubes. And I said to him, I said, you know, I'm gonna criticize your work from the point of view of an artist, of a writer, of a curator, and a collector, because I collect art as well. And, you know, this work looks like the rats are going to eat it, you know? I mean, you need to find a substitute like Duchamp did for the sugar cubes. Use marble or use something else, plastic or something, but, you know, make it out of resin or something. Or
I don't know about that. Well, that's a whole other discussion.
It is a whole nother discussion.
Yeah. Because I don't agree.
You know,
But
I do like with my students, I tell them, if you make a decision, it's going to be ephemeral. You need to know that.
Yeah.
Like when a collector asks you about a piece, oh, is this going to last? And then you ask the artist, and they're like, I have no idea. It's like, no.
Yeah.
Like you can make a decision, it's going to last or not, but you need to know what you're doing. In the meantime, I'm sorry to say we're out of time. You guys were great. That was great. Thank you so much.
thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Nice to
Thank
see
you all.
everybody.
But we just don't have time. But thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bravo.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you everyone for
Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great
Bye.
seeing you, Seph and Jane.
Yeah, for sure. Take
you.
care. Good night,
Thank you,
Paul. Good night,
guys.
Jane. Good night, Bill. Good night,
Good
everyone.
night, Seth.